Alright, let's go. Number 10. Monkshood and the Wolf's Bane murders. In 2014, botanist and poison historian John Mann at Queen's University Belfast published a study tracing the use of Aconitum napellus through medieval European court records. In inquest documents from 14th century England, deaths attributed to monkshood appear repeatedly with a distinctive notation that Mann found chilling in its consistency. The physicians could find no cause. The plant grew openly in monastery herb gardens across England, France, and the Germanic territories, cultivated for its legitimate medicinal properties as a pain reliever and fever reducer. It was also the most efficient untraceable killer in the medieval botanical arsenal. The chemistry is what makes monkshood devastating. The primary alkaloid, aconitine, is lethal in an adult human at a dose between 2 and 6 milligrams. That is roughly the amount that could fit on the head of a pin. The compound disrupts sodium ion channels in cardiac muscle cells, preventing the heart from maintaining its electrical rhythm. The result is ventricular fibrillation, the same cause of death listed on thousands of medieval death records attributed to natural heart failure. The symptom progression begins with tingling and numbness in the mouth and throat, progresses to nausea, vomiting and diarrhea, and culminates in cardiac arrest. There is no discoloration of the skin, no distinctive odor on the breath, no identifiable residue in the stomach that a medieval physician performing a rudimentary autopsy would recognize as foreign. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess and herbalist, explicitly warned against monkshood in her Physica, writing that it was entirely toxic, cold, and deadly, and advising that no one should eat it or use it. The plant's distribution across medieval Europe was total. It grew in every temperate zone from the British Isles to the Carpathians. Monastery gardens cultivated it alongside sage, rosemary, and lavender, using small doses as a topical pain reliever for joint inflammation and neuralgia. The Benedictine and Cistercian orders were among Europe's primary producers of herbal medicines, and monkshood appeared in their formularies as a standard ingredient. The same brothers who compounded pain remedies from aconitum had access to the plant in quantities sufficient to kill hundreds. The garden was unlocked. The knowledge was shared. The line between the infirmary and the graveyard was a matter of dosing that no external observer could monitor. Frederick Accum, working in the early 19th century, was among the first chemists to isolate the toxic principles, but his work came 800 years too late to help any medieval coroner. The specific forensic problem was total. Aconitin produces symptoms identical to dozens of natural diseases that killed routinely in the medieval world: gastric fever, heart failure, seizure, without chromatographic analysis, which would not exist for another 6 centuries. A monkshood death was indistinguishable from a natural death. A physician examining the body would find nothing unusual. A coroner recording the death would write fever, or heart failure, or sudden illness, and close the record. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Aconitine was not detected in human tissue until the development of advanced analytical chemistry in the 19th and 20th centuries. For the entire medieval period, roughly 1,000 years, there was no test for it. None. Zero. A poisoner using monkshood left behind a corpse that looked exactly like every other corpse that had died of fever and cardiac failure in a world where fever and cardiac failure killed constantly. Monkshood grew in the gardens of the people who prayed over the dead. The plant that stopped the heart was cultivated by the monks who buried the bodies. For 1,000 years, the murder weapon grew in the open, tended by the same hands that wrote the death records. No one tested for it, because no one knew there was anything to test for. Number 9. White arsenic and the inheritance powder. In 1998, historian Frank Collard at the Université Paris-Nanterre published a comprehensive study of medieval poisoning cases drawn from French royal and noble court records. His research, later expanded into the 2003 book Le Crime de Poison au Moyen Âge, revealed that arsenic trioxide, the white oxide of arsenic, was the single most frequently cited poison in European judicial proceedings from the 13th through the 16th centuries. The substance had a nickname that circulated openly among the noble families of France: poudre de succession, inheritance powder. The name tells the entire story. The properties that made arsenic trioxide the perfect medieval poison are almost absurdly suited to the task. White, odorless, tasteless, completely soluble in water and wine without changing the color, texture, or flavor of the liquid. The lethal dose ranges between 70 and 180 milligrams depending on the body mass of the victim. A pinch. Dissolved in a cup of wine, it vanishes. The symptom presentation that follows mimics cholera, dysentery, and gastric fever, the three most common natural causes of death in medieval Europe. Violent gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, organ failure over hours or days depending on the dose. The production process was neither secret nor difficult. Arsenic trioxide is produced by roasting arsenopyrite ore, a mineral found across Europe and mined commercially for use in glassmaking, pigment production, and metallurgy. The refined white powder was available from any apothecary, sold legitimately as a rat poison, a cosmetic skin whitener, and an ingredient in certain pharmaceutical preparations. A customer purchasing arsenic from an apothecary in 14th century Paris needed no explanation and left no suspicious record. Collard's case files document a pattern that repeats across centuries. The 1317 poisoning trial of Mahaut, Countess of Artois, accused of poisoning two French kings, Louis X and Philip V, to secure her family's inheritance claims to the county of Artois. The trial records, preserved in the Archives Nationales in Paris, describe testimony from servants who claim to have witnessed the preparation of poisoned food. The Countess was acquitted, but the accusations destroyed alliances that had taken decades to build. The 1440 trial of Gilles de Rais, where the secular and ecclesiastical charges centered on serial murder, heresy, and sodomy rather than familial inheritance schemes. While Collard's broader research highlights inheritance disputes among nobles, the crimes of de Rais represent a distinct category of predatory violence. Symptoms that physicians consistently attributed to natural disease, suspicions that could never be confirmed with the diagnostic tools available. The social architecture of medieval poisoning was as important as the chemistry. Arsenic was administered in households by people with daily access to the victim's food and drink. Wives, servants, cooks, confessors, physicians, anyone who shared a table or prepared a meal. The poisoner did not need to breach any security. The poisoner was already inside the household. The intimate domestic space that was supposed to protect the medieval noble was precisely the space where arsenic did its most effective work. The kitchen was the laboratory. The dining table was the delivery mechanism. The physician who attended the dying victim had no reason to suspect the food, because the food looked, tasted, and smelled exactly as it should. But here is where the conventional timeline collapses. The Marsh test, the first reliable chemical test for arsenic in human tissue, was not invented until 1836 by English chemist James Marsh. For the 5 centuries before that test existed, the only method of detecting arsenic in a body was to observe the symptoms and guess. Courts convicted poisoners based on testimony, confession under torture, and circumstantial evidence. The substance itself was invisible to every diagnostic tool available. Physicians could suspect. They could never prove. A white powder that tasted like nothing, dissolved into everything, and mimicked the diseases that killed half of medieval Europe anyway. Inheritance powder. The name was a confession that everyone understood, and no one could prosecute. The powder sat on apothecary shelves beside the medicines. The line between the cure and the murder was measured in milligrams, and no medieval physician had a scale fine enough to see it. Number 8. Belladonna and the Beautiful Death. In the collections of the National Library of Scotland, A 15th century herbal manuscript contains an illustration of a tropa belladonna with a marginal annotation in a later hand. The annotation, written in Latin, delivers its information with a brevity that collapses the distance between medicine and murder into a single sentence. 3 berries for the eyes, 10 for sleep, 20 for a sleep from which there is no waking. The dosing instructions for cosmetic use and lethal use are written in the same ink, in the same line, separated by nothing but a comma. The plant contains 2 primary alkaloids, atropine and scopolamine, both potent anticholinergic compounds that block acetylcholine receptors across the nervous system. Andrea Pierleoni, at the University of Bologna, traced belladonna's dual career in Renaissance Italy, documenting its simultaneous use as a cosmetic and as a murder weapon. The name itself, Belladonna, beautiful woman, refers to the practice of early modern and Renaissance Italian women dropping dilute belladonna extract into their eyes to dilate the pupils, a cosmetic trend popularized centuries after the dawn of the early medieval era. The same compound that widened the eyes at 3 berries stopped the heart at 20. The mechanism of death is anticholinergic toxidrome. The heart rate accelerates to unsustainable levels. Body temperature rises. The skin flushes red and dry. Delirium sets in, followed by seizures, followed by cardiac arrest. For a medieval physician examining the body, the symptoms presented as fever, delirium, and heart failure, indistinguishable from dozens of infectious diseases, in a period when infectious disease killed without explanation and without pause. The cosmetic trade in belladonna was substantial and documented. Venetian court records from the 15th century reference eye preparations sold by apothecaries and herbalists, specifically for pupil dilation. The trade was legal, profitable, and widespread. The same bottles that sat on a noblewoman's dressing table contained the same compound at the same concentration that could kill if the dosing shifted from drops to spoonfuls. The apothecary who sold the cosmetic preparation had no way of knowing whether his client intended to widen her eyes or stop a heart. The product was identical, only the dose and the target differed. The berries themselves are sweet, not bitter. Children ate them accidentally in fields across southern Europe. Adults fed them deliberately across dinner tables. The overlap between accidental ingestion and intentional poisoning was the poisoner's greatest structural advantage. A death from belladonna berries found in a garden could be attributed to a child's carelessness or a cook's mistake. The plant grew in the same hedgerows where families gathered blackberries and sloes. The lethal and the domestic occupied the same space. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Belladonna required no apothecary, no purchase, no record. The plant grew wild across Italy, southern France, and the Balkans. A woman could pick the berries from a hedgerow on a walk, crush them into wine that evening, and serve a death that looked like every other death in a medieval household, where fevers killed the young and old with merciless regularity. No transaction, no witness, no trace. The same plant that made women beautiful killed the men who looked at them. 3 berries widened the eyes, 20 stopped the heart. The distance between vanity and murder was 17 berries, and the plant offered them freely from every hedgerow in southern Europe. Number 7. Cantarella and the Borgia formula. In the Vatican's secret archives, documents from the pontificate of Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, contain references to a substance that historians have debated for 5 centuries without resolution. Contemporary accounts by Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies whose diary covering the years 1484 to 1506 survives in the Vatican Library, describe a series of deaths among cardinals and Roman nobles whose symptoms followed a pattern that Burchard recorded with increasingly clinical precision. The substance was called Cantarella. No sample of it has ever been recovered. The Borgia poisoning tradition is among the most documented and least verifiable assassination campaigns in European history. Michael Mallet at the University of Warwick and Sarah Bradford in her 2004 biography Lucrezia Borgia both examined the primary sources exhaustively. The specific cases attributed to the Borgias include the death of Cardinal Orsini in 1503 and the suspicious dinner at the vineyard of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi in the same year, where both Alexander VI and his son Cesare Borgia fell violently ill. Alexander died within days. Cesare survived, barely, after weeks of illness. The composition of Cantarella remains unknown. Leading theories proposed by historians and toxicologists include arsenic trioxide mixed with decomposed pig viscera to produce phosphorus compounds, cantharides derived from blister beetle extract, and various combinations of mineral and organic poisons designed to produce a delayed-onset death mimicking malarial fever. The symptom pattern in Burchard's descriptions is consistent with arsenic, but also consistent with the falciparum malaria that was endemic to Rome during the summer months when the deaths occurred. Cesare Borgia's own recovery, which involved being immersed in the carcass of a freshly slaughtered mule to draw the poison from his skin, suggests the Borgia's physicians believed the substance was something that could be counteracted through heat and absorption, a treatment consistent with metallic poisoning but not with malaria. The political context makes the forensic question nearly impossible to resolve. The Borgias operated in a Rome where poisoning was simultaneously feared, practiced, and fabricated as political currency. The death of any cardinal who held property or influence that the Borgias desired was immediately attributed to Cantarella by rival factions, regardless of the actual cause. Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia Borgia's first husband, accused the family of incest and murder in documents that survive in the Sforza archives. The Orsini family compiled dossiers of alleged Borgia poisonings. Each accusation served a political purpose. Each may also have been true. But here is where the conventional reading collapses into something stranger. Every death that benefited the Borgia family was attributed to Cantarella by their political enemies. Every accusation served the agenda of rival papal factions. The poison may have been real. The accusations were certainly weaponized. No one can separate the substance from the propaganda that surrounded it. The forensic impossibility cuts both ways. Medieval physicians could not prove that Cantarella was present in the bodies. They also could not prove it was absent. The Borgias may have poisoned dozens. They may have poisoned no one. The accusation itself was the weapon that survived. 5 centuries later, the formula is gone, the bodies are dust, and the reputation of a papal dynasty rests on a substance that no modern chemist has ever identified. The poison may be fiction. The fear it generated was not. Number 6. Hemlock and the Quiet Paralysis. In the British Library, a 13th century English manuscript of the Antidotarium Nicolai, a pharmaceutical compendium compiled originally at the medical school of Salerno in the 12th century, contains detailed instructions for preparing conium maculatum, poison hemlock. The text addresses the physician directly. It teaches how to dose hemlock as a sedative for surgical pain. In the same paragraph, using the same clinical language, it teaches the dose at which the patient will stop breathing. The transition between healing and killing occupies no more than a sentence. The primary alkaloid in poison hemlock is conine. Its mechanism of action is ascending paralysis. Weakness and loss of coordination begin in the lower extremities and climb steadily upward through the torso, the arms, and finally the muscles of the chest that control respiration. The diaphragm ceases to contract. Breathing stops. The victim suffocates. What makes hemlock uniquely horrifying among the poisons on this list is that the mind remains fully conscious throughout the process. The paralysis is muscular, not neurological. The victim feels the numbness climbing. The victim knows what is happening. The victim cannot move, cannot speak, cannot scream, and cannot call for help as the paralysis reaches the chest and the lungs stop filling with air. John Riddle at North Carolina State University documented the medieval pharmacological tradition surrounding hemlock in his 1992 study, Contraception and Abortion from the Ancient World to the Renaissance, published by Harvard University Press. Riddle traced the confusion between Conium maculatum and the water hemlock Cicuta virosa that plagued medieval herbalists, leading to accidental fatalities among physicians who believed they were administering a sedative dose and instead delivered a lethal one. The plant grew wild along roadsides, riverbanks and field margins across Europe. It required no cultivation, no purchase, and no specialized knowledge beyond the ability to identify its distinctive purple-spotted stem and mouse-like odor when crushed. The forensic problem for medieval investigators was absolute. Hemlock produces no inflammation of the digestive tract, no discoloration of the skin, no distinctive marks on the body. The cause of death is respiratory failure, and, in a period when pneumonia, tuberculosis, pleurisy, and dozens of other respiratory illnesses killed thousands annually, a hemlock death would appear on a coroner's record as suffocation or failure of breath. No further investigation would follow. The body would be buried. The plant would continue growing by the roadside where the poisoner had picked it. Socrates' execution by hemlock in 399 BCE had established the plant's reputation in the educated medieval mind, but the philosophical fame of that death obscured the plant's far quieter medieval career. Socrates' poisoning was public, deliberate, and documented. The medieval uses were none of those things. The Salerno medical school's texts traveled across Europe in the satchels of trained physicians who understood precisely what dose produced sedation and what dose produced death. The knowledge gap between these physicians and the coroners who might investigate a suspicious death was enormous. A Salerno-trained physician could kill with hemlock and diagnose the resulting death as natural respiratory failure, and both acts would draw from the same education. A weed that grew by every road in Europe could paralyze a body from the feet upward, while the mind inside it watched. The last thing a hemlock victim experienced was the knowledge that no one would ever know what had been done. The body showed nothing. The plant grew back the next spring, and the prescription for the lethal dose was written in the same book as the prescription for pain relief, separated by nothing but a quantity. Number 5. The Venom Ring and the Assassin's Jewel. In the collections of the Musée de Cluny in Paris, and in similar collections across European museums, curators have catalogued a category of object that does not appear in any official inventory of medieval jewelry. Rings with hollow bezels, rings with concealed cavities beneath the decorative stone, rings with tiny spring-loaded mechanisms that, when pressed against the skin during a handshake or a toast, could deliver a droplet of liquid through a needle-thin aperture concealed beneath the setting. Timothy Wilson at the Victoria and Albert Museum catalogued surviving examples as part of broader research into Renaissance personal accessories. The specimens date primarily to the 15th and 16th centuries, though references in earlier texts suggest the concept predates the surviving examples by centuries. The mechanical sophistication of the delivery systems varies. The simplest are hollowed bezels with removable caps. The most complex incorporate spring-loaded pins that retract when the ring is turned and deploy when the bezel is pressed against flesh. The poisons most suited to ring delivery were those requiring only a droplet to produce a delayed death. Concentrated aconitine extract, capable of killing through skin absorption in microgram quantities. Arsenic dissolved in acidic solution. Belladonna tincture concentrated to many times its natural potency. The advantage of ring delivery was twofold. First, the dose was so small that the total volume of poison in the ring's cavity need not exceed a few drops. Second, the entry point on the victim's skin was so tiny, a scratch indistinguishable from a rough seam on a glove or a splinter from a table edge, that no medieval physician would ever identify it as a puncture wound on a hand that had shaken dozens of other hands at a banquet. The cultural context made these rings possible and invisible. Medieval and Renaissance courts were environments of constant physical contact. Greeting rituals involved the kissing of rings, the clasping of hands, the touching of fingers to seal agreements. A poison ring was not an exotic weapon. It was an exploitation of social convention. The most dangerous moment was the most ordinary one: the extended hand, the formal greeting, the gesture of peace and trust that every courtier performed dozens of times at every gathering. The ring turned the ritual of courtesy into a delivery mechanism. The victim participated in their own assassination by following the basic etiquette of their class. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The rings survive. The poisons do not. The cavities are empty. Whatever substances once sat behind those tiny spring-loaded doors evaporated or was cleaned away centuries ago. What remains is the engineering. The deliberate, miniaturized precision engineering of a piece of jewelry whose sole purpose was to kill the person who touched the hand wearing it. Medieval goldsmiths built death into jewelry, a ring that delivered poison through a handshake. The victim would feel nothing, a faint scratch, no different from a rough seam on a glove. Days later, the fever. Weeks later, the funeral. The ring would be worn to the burial by the hand that had delivered the dose. The murder weapon was the mourning jewelry. Number 4. Aqua Tofana and the Women's Liberation of Naples. In 1659, authorities in Rome arrested a woman named Julia Tofana. Under interrogation, she confessed to something that terrified the papal court more than any plague or any foreign army. She had been manufacturing and distributing a clear, odorless, tasteless liquid poison to women across southern Italy for approximately 20 years. Her clients were wives. Her product was called Aqua Tofana, and by the estimates compiled by her prosecutors, it had killed over 600 men. The composition of Aqua Tofana has been reconstructed by modern historians and toxicologists, most notably by Mike Dash in his 2015 investigation, published in Smithsonian Magazine, and by historian Adriana Ferro at the University of Naples. The 3 probable ingredients were arsenic trioxide for the killing, lead acetate to further mask any taste, and belladonna extract to confuse the symptom presentation. The delivery protocol was precise: 4 drops in the husband's soup or wine, repeated over the course of several meals. The progression was designed to mimic a wasting illness, gradual enough that no physician would suspect poison, slow enough that the wife's grief would appear natural to the household and the community. The product was packaged in small glass vials labeled as a cosmetic preparation, or in some accounts, as the manna of St. Nicholas of Bari, a devotional liquid associated with the patron saint of the city. A woman purchasing a vial of Aqua Tofana appeared to be buying face cream or holy water. The distribution network stretched across Naples, Palermo, and Rome, operating for an estimated 2 decades before Julia Tofana was arrested, reportedly after a client lost her nerve and confessed to a priest. The trial records preserved in Roman archives document the scale: 600 men, not 600 deaths from a single hand. 600 sales. 600 women purchasing the means to kill 600 husbands in 600 separate households across southern Italy over 20 years. The mathematics of the operation is what collapses the conventional understanding of early modern poisoning. 600 is not a single political assassination. 600 is a covert domestic market. Tofana's network included trusted intermediaries in every major city of the southern Italian peninsula. Some accounts describe her own mother, Tofania d'Adamo, as the originator of the formula, executed in Palermo decades earlier for the same crime. If the accounts are accurate, the business was multi-generational. The knowledge of how to manufacture invisible death was passed from mother to daughter alongside the client list and the distribution routes. But here is where the standard explanation collapses into something stranger. Julia Tofana did not kill 600 men. She sold the product. The demand came from the women who bought it. Wives in a legal system where divorce did not exist, where domestic violence carried no legal consequence, where a woman's property, children, and bodily autonomy belonged entirely to her husband upon marriage. Aqua Tofana was not a poison. It was an exit, the only one available. For 20 years in southern Italy, a woman sold death in cosmetic bottles to wives who had no other way out of marriages they could not leave. 600 men died of what their physicians called illness. 600 wives buried their husbands with the poison still labeled as a saint's blessing on their dressing tables. The product was discovered. The demand that created it was not. Julia Tofana was executed. The marriages that drove her customers to buy did not change. Number 3. The Venomous Book and the Poison Page. In 2018, researchers at the University of Southern Denmark, led by analytical chemist Kare Lund Rasmussen, used X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy on a collection of early modern manuscripts in the university's library and detected something that should not have been present in the pages of old books. 3 volumes from the 16th and 17th centuries contained concentrations of arsenic compounds so high that handling them with bare hands could produce measurable toxic exposure. The discovery made international headlines. It also raised a question that medieval historians had been asking, mostly as a literary curiosity, for centuries. Could a book be a murder weapon? The tradition of the poisoned book appears across medieval and Renaissance sources, with a frequency that suggests more than folklore. Umberto Eco built the plot of The Name of the Rose around the concept in 1980, treating it as fiction. The historical record is less certain. Eleanor Janiger, a medieval historian at the University of London, compiled references to the poisoned page concept across multiple medieval sources, finding it in Italian, French, and Arabic texts spanning 5 centuries. The mechanics are straightforward. Arsenic compounds mixed with paste or size are applied to specific pages, concentrating on the upper corner where a reader habitually grips to turn the leaf. A reader who licks a finger before turning the page, a nearly universal habit, transfers the arsenic directly to the mucous membranes of the mouth. The Islamic parallel is older and more explicit. Ahmad Y. al-Hassan documented medieval Arabic awareness of contact poisons in his research on Islamic toxicology at the University of Aleppo. Ibn Washia's 10th century Kitab al-Sumum, the Book of Poisons, describes methods of applying toxic compounds to surfaces that a victim would handle, including documents and fabrics. The concept was not European in origin. It traveled the same routes as the medical texts themselves. The plausibility analysis is what makes the Danish discovery significant. Arsenic trioxide can be absorbed through skin and mucous membranes. Chronic low-dose exposure through repeated handling of a contaminated book would produce symptoms of gradual arsenic poisoning, hair loss, skin lesions, progressive organ failure occurring weeks or months after initial contact. The death would appear as chronic illness. No physician would think to examine the book. But here is where the conventional reading fractures. The Danish discovery does not prove that those specific books were deliberately poisoned. The arsenic came from a green pigment containing copper acetoarsenite, known as Paris green, used as a binding layer on the covers during 19th century rebinding processes. It may have been a later conservation treatment, but the discovery proves the concept was physically viable. A book treated with arsenic compounds would deliver a cumulative lethal dose to a reader who handled it regularly over weeks and months, and the cause of death would present as wasting disease. No medieval physician would ever think to blame a book that kills the person who reads it. The weapon is knowledge itself. The delivery method is curiosity. The victim handles the pages, licks a finger, turns a leaf, and absorbs a dose so small that illness arrives weeks later, with no memory of where it began. In a medieval world where books were rare and precious, and read only by the powerful, a poisoned volume would kill precisely the person important enough to be reading it. The pages survive. Whether they were loaded with intent remains a question the manuscripts themselves refuse to answer. Step back from the countdown for a moment and consider the pattern. Every poison on this list exploited the same fundamental vulnerability. Medieval medicine could not see what had been done. The tools to detect alkaloids, metallic poisons, and organic toxins in human tissue did not exist until the 19th century. For roughly 1,000 years of European history, a sufficiently knowledgeable poisoner, operated in a world without forensic science. The gap between the sophistication of the poisons and the sophistication of the detection methods was not narrow. It was absolute. The poisoners knew more about chemistry than the physicians who examined the bodies. That asymmetry is the engine that drives every entry on this list. The question is not how many people were poisoned in the medieval world. The question is, how many poisonings were never identified as poisonings at all? Number 2. The Poison Maidens and the Weaponized Body. In the Secretum Secretorum, a medieval pseudo-Aristotelian text that circulated across Europe and the Islamic world from the 10th century onward, translated into Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and half a dozen vernacular languages, there is a passage that has troubled scholars for a millennium. It describes a practice attributed to Indian kings who sought to eliminate their rivals without leaving any evidence of murder. Young girls were selected in childhood and fed increasing doses of poison, beginning with amounts so small the body could adapt and escalating steadily over years. By the time the girl reached maturity, her entire physiology was saturated with toxin. She had become immune. She was then sent as a diplomatic gift to a rival court. The king who touched the girl, who kissed her, or lay with her, would sicken and die. The girl herself, raised on the poison since infancy, would survive. The perfect assassination. The weapon was a person. The evidence was a gift. The concept is called the Visha Kanya tradition, and its transmission through medieval literature was documented by Adrienne Mayer at Stanford University in her 2019 paper published in the journal Classical Philology. Mayer traced the idea from its origins in Sanskrit texts, particularly the Arthashastra attributed to Kautilya, through Arabic translation into the medieval European Latin manuscripts that shaped the political imagination of the Western world. Roger Bacon referenced the poison maiden in his 13th century Opus Majus. Albertus Magnus cited the practice in his De Animalibus. Thomas Aquinas discussed it in his commentary on Aristotle. The concept was not marginal. It was embedded in the mainstream intellectual tradition of medieval Christendom. The pharmacological plausibility is what elevates this from legend to unsettling possibility. Modern toxicology confirms that chronic sublethal arsenic exposure produces tolerance in the exposed individual, a phenomenon called Mithridatism, after King Mithridates VI of Pontus, who famously ingested increasing doses of poison to render himself immune to assassination. The biological mechanism is the upregulation of arsenic methylation enzymes in the liver, allowing the body to process quantities that would kill an unexposed individual. The sweat, saliva, and other bodily fluids of a chronically arsenic-loaded person would contain concentrations of arsenic sufficient to produce toxic effects in an unexposed person through sustained intimate contact. But here is where the standard explanation collapses into something far more disturbing. The pharmacology works. That is not the unsettling part. The unsettling part is the delivery method. A human being converted into a weapon. A child raised from infancy for the sole purpose of becoming a lethal instrument, delivered as a gift, dressed as a bride, presented as an offering of peace. The killing accomplished not through a cup of poisoned wine or a blade in the dark, but through the most intimate human contact possible, and the death, when it came days or weeks later, would present as illness, no weapon, no wound, no trace. The most untraceable poison in the medieval imagination was not a plant, or a mineral, or a compound. It was a person, a girl raised on venom, whose touch was death. The concept circulated across 3 continents for 1,000 years, repeated by the most respected minds in the Western intellectual tradition. Whether it was ever practiced cannot be confirmed and cannot be ruled out. What survives is the idea itself, and the idea is this: in a world without forensic science, the perfect murder weapon could be disguised as a gift, not a gift of wine or jewelry or books, a gift of a human life, already loaded with the means to end another. Number 1. The School of Salerno, and the lost Pharmacopoeia of Untraceable Death. In the 11th century, in the coastal city of Salerno, in southern Italy, the first medical school in European history reached the height of its influence. The Schola Medica Salernitana trained physicians, compiled pharmacological texts, and served as the intellectual bridge between the ancient medical knowledge preserved in Arabic translation and the emerging medical tradition of medieval Christendom. Its graduates practiced across Europe. Its textbooks were copied and distributed to every major center of learning from Paris to Constantinople. Among its products was a body of toxicological knowledge so detailed and so dangerous that portions of it were restricted, copied only in abbreviated form, and eventually lost. Monica Green at Arizona State University has spent decades researching the medieval medical texts that originated at or passed through Salerno. The textual tradition is vast. The Antidotarium Nicolai, compiled in the 12th century, contains dosing information for over 100 plant and mineral compounds, organized as a practical pharmacist's manual. It includes opium preparations with precise quantities for sedation and for lethality. It includes hemlock extracts with the therapeutic dose and the killing dose written in adjacent lines. It includes mercury compounds, arsenic preparations, and henbane tinctures, each with instructions that cover the full range from treatment to termination. The Trachula texts, attributed to the female physician Trota of Salerno, contain knowledge of abortifacients, sedatives, and poisons derived from both European and Arabic pharmacological traditions. These texts circulated in dozens of manuscript copies across medieval Europe. Some copies are complete. Others show evidence of deliberate omission, passages removed or marked for restricted access, suggesting that medieval scribes recognized the danger of unrestricted distribution. The Trotula's survival in variant forms across libraries in London, Paris, Munich, and the Vatican indicates a text that was simultaneously in high demand and subject to ongoing censorship by the institutions that copied it. The convergence of traditions at Salerno is what made the school's toxicological knowledge uniquely dangerous. Greek sources from Dioscorides and Galen provided the botanical foundations. Arabic sources from Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Washia provided the pharmacological precision. Jewish physicians from the communities of southern Italy, who moved between Arabic and Latin medical traditions with fluency in both, served as translators and synthesizers. The resulting body of knowledge was not the product of any single culture. It was a fusion, assembled at a Mediterranean crossroads, where the accumulated poisoning expertise of 3 civilizations was compiled, refined, and taught to students, who then dispersed across a continent. The Arabic sources feeding into Salerno were even more explicit. Ibn Washia's 10th century Kitab al-Sumum, the Book of Poisons, is one of the most comprehensive toxicological manuals produced in the medieval world. It describes not only the properties and doses of individual poisons, but also the methods of administering them in ways designed to mimic natural disease. Slow poisoning protocols calling for subacute doses repeated over weeks and months, producing a gradual decline that no physician would attribute to anything other than illness. The victim sickens, physicians attend, remedies are attempted, the patient worsens and dies. The cause of death is recorded as whatever disease the symptoms most closely resembled. The poisoner's art, as transmitted through the Arabic tradition and absorbed by Salerno, was not the ability to kill, it was the ability to make the killing invisible. But here is where the standard explanation does not merely fall apart, it ceases to function entirely. The Salerno school did not teach poison as a dark art practiced in secret. It taught pharmacology as a unified science in which the same compounds that healed at one dose killed at another. The students who graduated from Salerno carried both sets of knowledge in the same education, dispensed from the same textbooks, learned from the same instructors. The distinction between physician and poisoner was not a matter of knowledge, it was a matter of intent, and intent leaves no residue that a medieval coroner could detect. The first medical school in Europe taught its students how to heal and how to kill, and it wrote both sets of instructions in the same books. The knowledge flowed from Arabic masters who had compiled centuries of toxicological observation into precise, repeatable formulas for invisible death. Some of those formulas survive in manuscripts scattered across European libraries. Others were deliberately suppressed, copied in fragments, or lost when the school's influence waned and its restricted texts were not reproduced. What remains is the certainty that for centuries, the most sophisticated pharmacological knowledge in the Western world included, as a standard component of the curriculum, the science of untraceable killing. The school is gone. The city remains. The manuscripts that survived contain the medicines. The ones that were destroyed may have contained something else entirely. And the physicians who graduated carried both bodies of knowledge in the same mind, dispensing one or the other as circumstance demanded, in a world that had no way to tell the difference. If you want to see more videos like this,